stop slipping, and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
What if I told you you could get some great quality, super comfortable kangaroo leather football boots for $150, but they're from a brand you've never heard of? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Kelme Trofeo Plus football boots, a brand that, believe it or not, has actually been around since the 90s. You may or may not have heard of them. I do think they have a particularly memorable logo with the paw print, but this is a football boot that gives you kangaroo leather in the forefoot, an overall modern, sleek, dare I say speed boot-esque silhouette, great fit and overall comfort, a solid sole plate and stud pattern, and retail for just $150. Although the label on the box that had a sticker I ripped off does list the price at 699 Chinese yuan, which would be the equivalent of about 96 US dollars. So there's obviously a bit of a markup for the American market. Even so, at $150, these are $100+ less expensive than the more popular top-end options that most people are after these days, and at what is basically cheaper than some mid-level takedown models, I think the quality would surprise a lot of people. So with that in mind, we're gonna go over all the details of the Trofeo Plus, talk about how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately conclude whether or not these are worth their $150 price tag, or potentially if you should look at other more value-conscious options from brands that you're more familiar with. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, as of right now, they're only available from Kelme directly, as far as I'm aware. 4 different colorways, $150. I think if you sign up for their email list, you get an extra 10% off. Regardless, that'll be linked down below if these are potentially of interest to you. And really quickly, if you enjoy seeing reviews of football boots you've maybe never even heard of before, don't forget to drop a like. And if you really appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions that get expressed on this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. So first things first, and this has nothing to do with performance, but it is ultimately very important as it relates to buying a new pair of football boots, and that is the way that these look, where I think very often from brands we've never heard of, the general consensus tends to be that the boots are kind of ugly. But in the case of the Kelme Trofeo Plus, I honestly don't think that's the case. Where obviously this is a whiteout colorway, or what once was a whiteout colorway, but I think they've done a really good job of not overdoing it. I think the lines that you have in the forefoot in that debossing of the kangaroo leather looks quite sleek and modern. The K logo as their main branding, which also has kind of like a 3D texture to it, is subtle enough while still getting the point across. And I just personally like the Kelme paw print logo, which you have there on the back of the heel, and then one more on top of the forefoot. They're even available in 3 other colorways, which aren't all my favorite admittedly, but as far as a new silhouette is concerned, I actually think it's a pretty good looking boot, but I'd be curious to hear your opinions. As far as the performance side of things goes, this follows a very similar recipe to a lot of modern leather football boots in that the leather is focused predominantly in the forefoot and toe box area, where you can very clearly see the seam, and then from that seam back, it transitions into a synthetic leather material that's still very soft and matches the thickness of the actual leather in the forefoot, and then you just have more of like a textured synthetic material as you get to the ankle and heel area. Where it's not super important, but I did notice it on their website, the product images of all 4 colorways are correct and exactly as the boots will come, but there are some promotional images of the Trofeo Plus on the Kelme website where you'll notice that the kangaroo leather does not have this seam right here. It flows all the way back through the midfoot, but in reality, that seam does exist. I'm not sure why their promotional imagery doesn't line up with the actual final product. I'm sure it's just some kind of a mistake, but if you did also make that connection, just realize this is the version of the Trofeo Plus that is actually going to ship to you. As for the kangaroo leather in the forefoot, despite the $150 price tag being on the lower side for football boots these days, this leather is super soft. You can see it does have a little bit of what looks to be an internal support cage, but this is actually pressed into the leather itself, where I would assume, based on how this appears to be constructed, because they don't give very detailed tech specs on the website, the only thing they specify is that it's Kel-Tec leather, which doesn't really mean anything. They do specify kangaroo leather, but all they really do from a technology standpoint is add Kel to the beginning and call it a day, hence the Kel Power Frame sole plate. Nonetheless, what you get here is a super soft leather material, but it's been kind of compressed to be on the thinner side. So from a touch on the ball perspective, you still get that softness and kind of slight bit of dampening sensation that we've come to expect from a natural kangaroo leather material, but certainly it's not overly padded. And I don't necessarily want to call it a barefoot sensation, because there's definitely more padding to this upper than what you'd find from something like an F50 or a Mercurial as an example. But if I had to make a comparison to another pair of football boots, it would be something along the lines of the Mizuno Morelia Neo, which I would argue does have nicer leather, certainly on the $320 made in Japan variation, but for half the price, the quality of this leather and the feel it has both on feet as well as on the ball is super impressive. Like I mentioned earlier, that leather does end as you get into the midfoot area, but the synthetic leather they've used here actually feels really nice, and I do like the fact that it matches the thickness of the leather in the forefoot. So from a touch on the ball perspective, the thickness is very uniform across the entire foot, and as far as the surface texture is concerned, it's been left very, very smooth, like a traditional leather football boot would typically be. So in the way of extra grip, simply put, there isn't any. Moving across the top of the foot, you're going to find what is a one-piece enclosure, with the central portion of the upper being filled in with an elasticated knit material. It uses a central lacing system with a dual lace hole setup, as we've seen from so many different football boots. And all in all, the materials they've used, the way that they've cut the lacing system, and just generally the way that these boots fit, feels really, really good. Very impressed, because we see this type of design so often from a bunch of different brands, but if you don't get the shape right, it kind of just ends up feeling clumsy. Not the case here whatsoever. No extra material, no extra space. Everything just feels like it should. Wraps your foot very closely without being uncomfortable. Moving to the rear, you'll find what is a pretty standard low-cut football boot design these days, in that you have an internal plastic heel counter providing plenty of structure at the back, and then kind of bordering the edges of the opening, you have a little bit of that elasticated knit, creating what I would call a mock collar, but realistically, it's just a little bit of material to kind of take the roughness off the edge, and a little bit of an extension tail as well, made from that elastic material, which helps with putting the boots on, but ultimately serves no real purpose in terms of comfort or performance. Internally, you have this really soft microfiber lining material with plenty of padding. Again, the design and shaping, I think they've absolutely nailed, which is not super common in my experience with a lot of these lesser known brands. And then the insole, fully removable, I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It's very standard in terms of just being a mesh liner on the surface, and then it's made from a single layer of this white foam with really nothing happening on the bottom. It's a decent pair of insoles, but it's certainly nothing groundbreaking. But again, for 150 bucks, you can only really expect so much. And then moving to the base, they've gone for what is ultimately a more traditional design, but one that doesn't necessarily feel old school, if that makes any sense. Like I showed you earlier, you have the Kel Power Frame, which has plenty of structure through the midfoot and heel, but in the forefoot, is just very soft and flexible. So it's not really a super responsive speed boot type of feel, despite this definitely having a little bit more of a speed boot-esque silhouette. Nonetheless, I think the super flexible sole plate pairs really nicely with what is ultimately a thin, soft, and flexible upper. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, which is the only available stud pattern for this boot at this point in time, it's conical studs all throughout. Very standard layout in the forefoot, very standard layout under the heel, but they still have some decent length to them, but do have a larger profile, meaning that in terms of traction, they still have plenty of bite. You're definitely not going to be lacking in grip on a firm natural grass playing surface. And because of their rounded shape, you're still going to have that freedom to twist and pivot, but the larger stud shape means that they're not going to bite quite as hard as, again, some of the more speed-focused football boots currently on the market. A close equivalent in terms of feel would be something along the lines of a Nike Tiempo. And then there's the weight, where I think the best way to show how light or heavy something is by way of comparison. And I think a close comparison, both in terms of characteristics as well as price, is the Copa Icon 2 at $180, both in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Icon 2s, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.1 ounces, the equivalent of 201 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Kelme Trofeo Plus, and you can see that they weigh in at 8.8 ounces, granted with a little bit of mud on them still, the equivalent of 249 grams. Where granted, the Copa Icon 2, while it might not look like it, is actually one of the lighter football boots currently on the market. So at, let's call it 45 grams more, the Kelme Trofeo Plus isn't necessarily heavy, but they're not going to be as light as a lot of top-end models out there right now. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, honestly, no complaints. Kelme haven't gone and tried to do anything crazy with the design or construction of this football boot. The leather in the forefoot is super soft. The synthetic leather through the midfoot is also really soft. The shaping and one-piece construction has the perfect amount of stretch, volume, and width where it wraps your foot very, very closely, where they still fit snug, but don't necessarily have that squeeze your foot sensation. That isn't necessarily a bad thing if you want it to feel like a pair of speed boots, but these have that snug all over fit while still maintaining the comfort I think you expect from something with a kangaroo leather upper. The low cut design in the heel and the padding through the heel liner is fantastic. The super soft microfiber liner on the inside of the upper provides a really nice soft feel against your foot as well. The boots as a whole still hold nice structure, meaning that your foot feels very secure and locked in, which also gives these a little bit more of a responsive sensation than I think a lot of people might expect. And the more flexible sole plate construction I also think works really, really well with how soft and pliable this upper is. From a width perspective, they have some decent width to them, although like most boots with a one-piece upper construction, if you have exceptionally wide feet, particularly through the midfoot, you might find these to be a little bit snug, but honestly, I do think from a width perspective, they're going to work well for the vast majority. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, I've genuinely been very impressed with the Trofeo Plus. For a brand that hasn't been super relevant in the world of football boots for a very long time, if ever, Kelme have done a fantastic job of doing a design that is both modern but also relatively simple, while also incorporating kangaroo leather, which is something that we're seeing less and less of these days, while also pricing their product appropriately at basically half of what you are used to paying for a normal top-end product. Where granted, I'm not trying to suggest that the Trofeo Plus is the best leather football boot on the market. That would be a bit of an exaggeration, because I think just between Adidas and Mizuno alone, there are just so many great leather football boots that you could buy. Having said that, all of those alternatives are more expensive than the Trofeo Plus, and at $150 for a kangaroo leather that feels as premium and as soft as this one does, if we're talking football boots at full retail, this is a pretty tough one to beat. And that's honestly something I was not expecting to say.